if you're going to move forward in being an expert on estate planning to help your clients, one, realize you don't need to know all the little things about how to draft a will, what's in a will, what are these terms. You just need to know the basic concepts, and you will be an expert in the financial realm of understanding wills and trusts and the documents that are necessary to distribute property after someone passes, and also handling incapacity issues. So estate planning is that twofold system. One is, what if they die? And the other one is, well, what if they're still alive but can't handle their affairs? We want to handle both of those issues. Before we go into that, I want to talk about community property law and separate property law. So it's easy to understand this if you understand the history, so I'm going to give you a little history. In the Americas, we have two main philosophies. The third philosophy, the French system or the Napoleonic Code, is only followed in one state, and that's Louisiana. And I know very little about Louisiana law. I'm familiar with most separate property states and community property states. Community property states come from the Spanish tradition. So states that are going to be close to Mexico will be community property states. You got Texas, you got California, you got New Mexico, Arizona, community property states. And the concept under community property law is everything in the family is shared 50-50 between a husband and wife. Husband and wife, all their assets are 50-50. All their debts are 50-50. Everything is 50-50. And so in a community property system, it's pretty simple to understand because when we divide everything, we just go, well it's 50-50. Now, in most community property tradition, everything is community property unless it falls under three categories. That's the easiest way. Just understand with your clients, if you're in a community property state, everything is community property unless it falls under these three things, and then it would be considered a separate property. One, earned before marriage. If you earned property before marriage, it's separate property. Now, separate property can be converted into community property over time or by commingling. So you may have a business, or you have a client who has a business, and he's about to get married, and he says, I don't need a prenup. I owned this before we were married. Well, it can convert into community property over time because as you pay taxes on the business starts morphing into something that was totally different before you got married. It's hard to make that argument 20 years down the road when he's getting divorced that he owned it before. Well, yeah, you owned it 2 years before, but for 20 years you've been married. It's community property now. So first and foremost, understand everything is community property, and you can explain this to your clients, or a client that's about to get married, or a client that's going to do their study. Everything's community property unless it was earned before marriage. Number two, you inherited it. But inheritance, once again, falls under the same kind of concepts. Did you commingle the funds into an account? How do we now know what's separate or community? So the judge is going to say it's community. And third, if you received a settlement for a personal injury to pay for your injuries. So this would not be a settlement because you were emotionally harmed or something like that. This is to pay for your injuries. So if you understand that, you understand community property. Now let's go to the other system. The majority of the states follow the separate property system. The separate property system, as maybe you can imagine, comes from England. It's the common law. That's what we refer to, another term that we're going to throw out there. And this common law, of course, since the original 13 colonies, they were all from England. This law is what spread to most states. And the idea is husband and wife have their own separate property. However, husbands and now wives have a duty to take care of the spouse, especially if the spouse was not earning any income or had less of an education. So under these concepts, and every state's going to be different under separate property because this is a little bit harder to deal with than community. Community property is 50-50, this is divided. Separate property, you have different traditions. You're going to have systems where they're going to be more protective over women because Men are the primary earners, and we don't want men or a wife to stay home, raise a kid, and then the man to run off with a new wife and leave her homeless. So we have ideas of spousal support, where in community property states you don't have those kind of concepts. So you have to become familiar. Now, it's not difficult. We don't need to get into a big discussion on separate property law and community property law and understand each individual detail what could be. You just need to know this. Are you in a community property state or a separate property state? And generally understanding, if you're in one of those states, how the property is titled and held. Now, most financial institutions come from New York, and so they understand the system, and the laws are written under a separate property idea. For example, our federal law is, with retirement accounts, is very much under a separate property idea. An IRA or 401k cannot be held jointly. It is held individually by the person who earns it. But when you're dealing with that kind of concept in the state of Texas, we don't care in a divorce if it's held individually in a 401k. It's community property in our state. So when we are doing estate planning, this is part of the process that you need to understand. Is if you're in a separate property state, what's going to happen? Who really owns that property when someone passes away? Who owns that IRA? Who owns that 401k? And how is it passed? Same thing in a community property state. Well, who's going to own these accounts? How is it distributed? Now, the attorney's job is to draft the documents correctly that the property passes according to the rules that it needs to pass under. But as a financial advisor, it's very important that you understand those basic concepts when the attorney calls you to, hey, I need you to put the beneficiary designation on this account. Well, first off, you shouldn't listen to the attorney. Make sure your client calls you. But when he asks, oh, put this account into husband's trust. Well, he's considering it his separate property. It's going into his trust. So this should give you a basic understanding of community property, separate property. If you want to, this is my advice to you. If you're gonna do this, go to Google right now. Type in separate property law in wherever you live, Georgia. And then just read 2 or 3 paragraphs and you'll know far more than 90% of the financial advisors out there. Simple as that. Do it right now.